Welcome to 94.1 FM, 3WBC with Guirguis on Downtown. And tonight, my special guest is Paul Dellios, Principal and Founding Partner at the Dellios West & Co. Good evening, Paul, and thank you for allocating the time tonight.
Good evening, Jerry, and I'm more than happy to be of help.
Paul, let's start a couple of issues. We want to talk about burials, and we also want to talk about NDIS. And if we can start with burials, who ends up paying the burial fees to have penniless persons with no next of kin?
Now, you've really defined the subject of the burial quite well, because a lot of people will normally just refer to it as a pauper's burial. When we talk about a pauper's burial, there are two different categories. One is people who do have family but have no money and can't afford to conduct a normal funeral. And in that case, there are charitable organisations around who will assist, and therefore they don't have to fall into the second category. So sometimes people like the Salvation Army will assist, and sometimes there are other organisations, and quite frankly, if somebody feels that they fall into that category, then they can just Google pauper's funeral, and the name of several charities will come up who will be able to assist them to get a very simple but respectful funeral take place. But that's not what you asked about. What you asked about is somebody who perhaps is homeless or generally sleeping rough, or even if they're not homeless, may not be, let's say, someone whose family can be found if there is a family. Or in fact, of course, there are circumstances where people just don't have a family. As much as we'd like to think that everyone has someone who cares for them, it's not always the case. And in that case, then there are special arrangements, and it falls into a possibility of 4 different categories, depending again what the circumstances are, or who might be contacted first. Now, one category is the really, really obvious one, and that is if someone in those circumstances actually dies in hospital. So, ambulance is called and someone is found in the street somewhere, and they die, but they don't die in the street. They're carted off to hospital and they don't recover, and they eventually die in the hospital. In those circumstances, if nobody else comes forward, it's the hospital's responsibility to have them buried at the hospital's cost.
Right. Okay. That's very interesting.
Yep. Secondly, if it's not that, and they do end up perhaps at the coroner's premises, then it becomes the responsibility of the state government. And the coroner organises that, and again, arrangements for a burial to be made. Obviously, again, especially if someone can't be identified, then they'll be buried in an unmarked grave with no identification at all. The third category is if the person who died is recognised as being a returned serviceman or woman. And in those circumstances, the Department of Veteran Affairs will take responsibility and have, I wouldn't call it a military funeral, but a funeral that they conduct for former service people. And occasionally, very occasionally, Centrelink might also be involved, but that would be difficult because it's a question of who would know what enough about the deceased person to think of applying to Centrelink and in what circumstances Centrelink will help. So they're the different categories of how they're dealt with, and as terrible as it sounds, at least they are dealt with, and they aren't left, unburied or undisposed. Now, in just about all those categories, the burial will be by way of a cremation rather than an interment, because it's more expensive to have an interment, and someone's got to buy the plot, and then in whose name will that reside afterwards. So it's normally by way of a cremation, and these organisations usually have arrangements with funeral directors who provide these services, by some special arrangement, so that it's done on the one hand properly, but on the other hand, of course, it's not going to be done, in an expensive manner. So you don't expect to see somebody carted off in a gold coffin. So, and there's no other limitations. So it's not as if there's a shortage of availability for these things to happen. I mean, they're really not that common. One reason they're not that common is the fact that these days, even homeless people card, whether it's a credit card, whether it's driver's license, whether it's telephone. So quite often it increases the ability for them to be traced, and perhaps for family to be traced. But there is still a small proportion or a small fraction of people who passed away in circumstances where not only they're actually disadvantaged, but circumstances where they either can't be identified at all. Now, those people who can't be identified at all, they can be kept just in case a family member is located. They can be kept for 2 or 3 or 4 years before the remains are actually disposed of.
Wow. Well, I suppose these days you can also imagine the DNA kicking in, and people would take a DNA and then do a DNA match sometime down the track.
I must say that that's a possibility that I haven't seen applied in these circumstances, but you're right. I think that with modern technology having advanced, you think that would be a sensible thing to do. And I suppose it really does become a question of whether the organisation which is handling this, and in those circumstances where someone's not identified, it's not going to be the DVA. It's not going to be Centrelink. So it's either going to be the hospitals or the coroners. And of course, they are the ones who have access to this technology. So why would they not use it? And it's a very good suggestion you've made, and it's be a sensible thing to do. But it does require that there be records of DNA that can be matched.
Yep, absolutely correct. Yes,
because it's one thing to have a DNA test to be done to determine somebody's parentage, because you've got 2 records to match. But if you haven't got another record to match it up with, then you can have the test and still not achieve any outcome.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. I'm quite surprised I'm not too clear on a couple of things. One of them is the under what circumstances the coroner's tax charge. I'm not too sure where the link is. Why would the coroner fork out the money?
Well, the coroner will fork out the money if a deceased person is delivered to the coroner's office. And that's going to happen in circumstances where the coroner insists, because there needs to be an investigation done to determine the cause of death for somebody. But it also will happen in circumstances where there is no one to claim the body.
Yep. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm actually surprised by the number of years, Mr. Dellios, the number of years you would actually hold on to the body until something happens. That's quite a long time.
It is, isn't it? And thank goodness that it's such a small number of people who it can relate to, or it does relate to. It's not as if there's 1,000 bodies stacked at the coroner's facilities because they're sitting there, or not sitting there, they're lying there waiting to be identified. It is really a very small number, and therefore it's not a great inconvenience and not a great cost to keep them there.
The one thing I've got some data, and the issue was that we had something like about 400 to 500 of these circumstances where people have died, whether they died at hospital or elsewhere. But the number, we believe that it's on the increase. There is more people that fall in that category where, they are penniless and they don't have a next of kin. Other NGOs that are in the state have tried to find some next of kin, but they failed to do so. But I'm concerned because the numbers are on the increase. And secondly, I do understand you made the point that they are cremated, they're not actually buried. But a couple of the burial people that I got in contact with, they said, we have allotments somewhere in Whoop Whoop out in the sticks, and as an organisation we allocate some, but there is more and more of these people being sent to us to bury for no charge. And so I'm just surprised by the number of these cases are coming through.
Well, the trouble, of course, is that as the number of people who are homeless or generally destitute increases, then, of course, the number of them who eventually die is going to increase as well.
Yes.
And if they haven't been ameliorated to some degree by becoming involved with people like the Salvation Army while they're alive, because if they become known to the Salvation Army when they're alive, then the Salvation Army has a very good chance of finding their family. I mean, generally speaking, the Salvation Army does provide a family location service, not only for people who have died, but for people who are still alive. If the circumstances are such that they can't find family members, the Salvation Army will actually help to try to find family members and reunite the family in many, many cases.
Mr. Dellios, I've got to ask the burning question that's in my head, that's raising all these flags. Why isn't it a state commitment? why isn't it the state that says, okay, we've got 400 a year, it might go up to 450 a year. All the organisations, whether it's Salvation Army or other NGOs, have done their due diligence, and then, okay, we don't have an next of kin. The cost will be incurred by the state. Why doesn't the state take charge of it?
But they do if there's no one else.
Oh, okay, they do. Okay, right, okay.
Hmm.
I just find, so if you die in hospital, the hospital would ring up the state and say, listen, I've got one of those cases, pay up the cost?
No, because obviously the public hospitals are considered to be part of the state, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I've forgotten that one. Well, they're not going to end up in the private hospitals. No. Okay. Right. Well, that one's ticked. Let's on the issue of NDIS, Paul. Now, what is the NDIS's definition of a person having a disability? And I've got questions that will come as a result of that. So let's start with the basic Disability Discrimination Act definition, or what you might have as an understanding of a disability.
Well, there are a couple of basic requirements. The first one is that you have to be permanent resident of Australia.
Right.
The second one is that you must be younger than 65 years of age when you first apply. Yes. And then the third one is that you need to have a disability caused by an impairment.
Right.
So the requirements to qualify for a disability are that you have a disability that's caused by an impairment, that the impairment is likely to be permanent, that it results in you having a substantially reduced functional capacity to do one or more daily life activities. And examples of those include moving around, communicating, socializing, learning, undertaking self-care or self-management tasks. Then your impairment has to affect your ability to work, study, or take part in social life. And finally, you're likely to meet the need for NDIS supports for your whole life. In other words, it has to be permanent.
Yep. Okay.
So one example is a young chap, well, he's getting on now, but when he was about 30-ish, he enjoyed himself more than he should have and fell off a balcony about 6 stories up.
Right.
And landed head first at the ground.
Yep.
Now, he survived that fall. Took a long, long time for him to be rehabilitated. But on a good day, you can have a discussion with him and you wouldn't realise he's got a disability. On a bad day, he slurs his words so badly that you'd have trouble understanding him.
Right.
He can walk, and he does walk, but he requires a caliper device to be attached to one of his knees to be able to do that. His walk, again, on bad days, is very unstable, and he often will fall over while he's walking. Mm-hmm. He has a disability pension, but that's not officially a criteria for NDIS. But he has a disability pension, and he also has qualified for NDIS support in addition to that.
Yep.
And his NDIS plan, let's say, is anticipated that is going to cost, on today's prices, it's going to cost the government about $500,000 for his NDIS benefits over the rest of his life.
That's quite substantial. I wanted to go on the question, Paul. If NDIS, and I had no idea about disability pension, if NDIS rejects an application for service, can the applicant appeal?
Yes. So, well, it's a fairly typical but complicated procedure.
Right.
Appealing against administrative decisions. It's not that different from the procedures to appeal against Centrelink decisions. So the first step is that from the date of being notified of a decision that you're not happy with, you've got a period of 3 months to ask for an internal review. Once that review is completed, if you don't like the outcome, then you can make an application to the Federal Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And once you're in that federal system, you get a decision from the tribunal. If you don't like that decision, you appeal to the Federal Court of Australia. And if you don't like that decision, you appeal to the full Federal Court of Australia. And if you don't like that decision, in some circumstances, you can get special leave to appeal to the High Court.
Obviously, we don't have a lot of cases that have gone straight up to the hierarchy, to that level.
No, but there have been cases that have gone to the Federal Court.
Yes.
And one of those was decided in the second half of last year, where the Federal Court had to decide what the meaning of a couple of words in the NDIS regulations are.
Correct.
One of those words is the meaning of the word remedy, and the other one is the meaning of the word available. And without going into a technical explanation, the Federal Court's version of what the meaning of those words is was more lenient and more favourable to the person seeking the support of the NDIS and less favourable to the NDIA, which is the agency that administers the NDIS. And the result of that is that they now have a court ruling that says that their previous version, which restricted what they were providing, has to be revised so that there's a broader response, and they're providing more remedies, and there are more services available to the participants, the members. So in practical terms, think of it this way. Before this decision, this year's annual budget for from the federal government to run the NDIS, $35 billion, right? That was before this decision. This decision will make it more expensive because there are services that were not budgeted to be provided based on the old definitions of these two words.
Correct.
So there'll be more services provided. So the 35 billion figure will grow to a higher figure. Now, how much difference that is, who'll know? We may never know, depending on how detailed statistics the NDIA keeps of the cost of services that they actually provide. So, because the budget may be blown out for another reason, not necessarily just because of the court decision in relation to the meaning of these two words.
I I had no idea about the spectrum of the 35 billion billion that, and it's going to increase. And the thing that comes to my mind straight away is that, well, you know, some applicants would have been rejected years ago. Do we backlog and do we go back? Do we compensate for that? You know,
Well, I don't think you can get it retrospectively. You get
Yep.
the service from when they start giving you the service. It's how can you be basically given whether counselling treatment or therapy or whatever retrospectively, because it's not a matter of handing over money.
No, I agree. I understand. Yes.
Um, Now, of course, what I haven't told you is that if you don't really want to go through that procedure, you can just reapply at any time. You
what's
don't
the
have
chance
to.
of being what's the chance of being rejected again?
Well, it depends on why you were rejected in the first place. Maybe you didn't provide enough medical evidence.
Oh, okay. Yep. Okay.
Maybe, who knows? I mean, there are so many reasons that applications can be rejected, and if there is no point in appealing if your application that you've done
Yes.
doesn't meet the requirements. So you must
Yep.
get your application correct in the first place,
Correct. Yes.
and then say, oh, but I have provided everything, and yet I'm still not getting the approval I want, or I've got the approval, but I'm not getting the extent of services that I need. And that's what that federal court decision was about last year. It wasn't someone who wasn't approved. It
Yep.
was someone who wasn't getting the level of service that they considered that they should get.
Mr. Dellios, I do sincerely want to say thank you ever so much. Our time is up once again, but I do look forward to another session. And again, thank you so much for giving us all this informative information, both on the penniless people and NDIS and NDIA. Thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure.